Okay, welcome. Thank you all for watching. This is BenThere, episode 26, with Jen Mohindra, and I'm going to get to her in just a second. But I just want to say thank you, I guess, first of all, for all of those of you that maybe have followed us. And yesterday we were supposed to go. Life happens, things happen, but we're able to go today. So thank you all for watching. I appreciate that. Like I said, this has BenThere, episode 26, and we are officially live. So the concept of the show is pretty simple. It's about people. That's why I'm doing this show. It's about people, specifically third culture kids, those of us that have grown up outside our passport country. My guest today definitely is no exception to the rule here. She's coming to us all the way from London, England, hence the time difference here. So I appreciate that. She's someone who grew up in the UK, Australia, and Kenya. I can't wait to talk to her. This is going to be fun. I want to introduce Miss Jen Mohindra. Jen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ben. Very happy to be here, and thanks for your flexibility on reshuffling to today.
No worries. You and I were talking offline before we went live that it's kind of one of the, I guess, the benefits of COVID is that I'm able to work from home a little bit. So this is perfect. I do want to mention that my dog may join us. She loves, I don't know if you can see the blue blanket here that's on my chair, but she loves to kind of jump on and say hey to everybody too. So if she comes through the door, don't be alarmed. It's all good. So,
no worries.
Yeah, she's not camera shy. Let's put it that way. So, but look, I want to get right to it. I want to be respectful of your time, and I know you're going through some things right now, and that's awesome. But if you could just summarize, the whole third culture kid. I can't wait to talk about this because you and I have so much in common without even knowing it. I've never spoken to you before. We've never really even met before until this interview. But if you could just kind of summarize your upbringing, where you're originally from, how you ended up living internationally, all that stuff, just so the people that are watching, can hear that, I guess. So go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm going to give you the time's yours. So
thanks. So I was born a long time ago in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and I lived there only for my first year. In fact, I was actually adopted in Scotland by a white English family, and they moved me to Australia when I was 1 year old, and we lived in Melbourne for about 3 years. And then after that, we upped and moved again. So I had pretty much just started kindergarten in Australia. And then we came back to the UK, and I lived just outside Manchester from the age of 4 till just before I turned 8. Spent some of my primary school years there. And then after Manchester, we moved again. This time we went to Kenya. I lived in Nairobi for 5.5 years. Wow. And then after that, at the age of 13, I then moved again with my family, and we went back to Australia, but to the other side, to Perth in West Australia, and I spent my teenage years there. And then after that, I made the first move by myself as a fully fledged grown-up and moved back to the east coast of Australia, this time to Sydney. And then more recently, my latest move has been Sydney to London, which is where I currently live.
Okay. No, and I'm going to start this off right away by giving you the ever popular TCK question. Where's home then? If you've been all over the place and you've lived in the UK, you've been in Australia, and you've been in Kenya, where's home to you?
I would say that home can be more than one place. I've been away from Sydney for a long time, but I always think of Sydney as one of my homes. But London for me is it's the longest I've ever lived in one place, and I've sort of worked hard to put down roots and make myself feel at home here, which is, I have to say, it's quite easy to do in London because it's so multicultural, it's so diverse. There's not that many actual Londoners here, so I'm the perpetual foreigner wherever I go, but nobody bats an eyelid at that here in London.
No, I get that totally. That's how I live in Utah, and I'm obviously in the States, but I live in Utah, and in the same way, I didn't grow up here. My wife's from here. I would come here in the summers because my grandparents were here, but I don't have a true connection here. It just seems to be where I've always, based on the fact that I would come here in the summertime. I grew up in Hong Kong and Taiwan and all that stuff, but we would come back here, and so I guess this was almost like base camp, right? It doesn't really feel like home, and yet it doesn't really. I'm pretty used to it, but it still doesn't really feel like home. So I appreciate that answer. Well, let's get right into it. Let's talk about positives and negatives then. Talk about the positives and negatives about growing up overseas.
Well, I have to say this is a great question, and I've kind of baked my whole career on this now.
Yeah, we're going to talk about your career later. I can't wait to talk about it. But yeah, talk about the positives and negatives, though. Yeah.
Sure. So I think the sort of thing that comes first of all to mind is about tolerance, because we, from a very young age, have been exposed to different cultures, different countries. We've seen how people live differently, and the sort of common thread as we've moved around has been that, well, actually, at the end of the day, we're all just people. So underneath those differences, we are fundamentally very similar. So I think we have a very good mind to be open to other people's differences. I'd say that's one of the main positives. But you've got things like, languages and exposure to things like that. On the less happy side, if you like, I think there's certainly plenty of challenges that come with being a TCK. Obviously, all those moves growing up might have meant changing schools, changing friends, lots of goodbyes. And I can certainly remember from my own experience that when we moved from one place to the next, when I was a child, there wasn't really much consultation with me about where we would go. It was kind of like, Jenny, we're going here, we're moving on, pack up.
Yep.
And not pack up everything, but pack up what can fit in the crate. So you kind of get used to feelings around loss, grief, goodbyes. But again, a positive, I think, that comes out of that is resilience. And in many of the Facebook groups, the other TCK communities that I belong to, resilience is a key word that comes up from time and time again. I think one of the other challenges is around not having a place that you can say, yeah, that's my home, that's where I was born and brought up, that's where I look back to, and I've always got that place to go back to. And that might also include not having family in one particular place. And if I think of myself growing up, I didn't really have close relationships to my extended family. They were sort of people that I might have seen on holidays here and there, but I didn't even meet all of my grandparents, and those that I did, I really didn't know them very well at all.
Oh, really? Yeah, that's interesting because when I was like my brother and I, same kind of exactly to a T of what you just said. But yeah, we would come back to the States in the summer. We'd spend half our summers here in Utah, my mom's side of the family, and then we go to Pennsylvania, USA, on the East Coast, and spend it with my dad's side. So yeah, I totally understand that. I get the confusion, the uncertainty, the everything. You label it any way you want, but I totally understand what you're getting at. So yeah,
That's the thing. It's you mentioned the word label, and I think society is obsessed with labels, and we particularly feel that as TCKs, because when we meet people for the first time, they want to put a label on us, but we don't quite fit.
Yeah, absolutely. The irony is, and we'll talk about this later too, is like I'm in Utah. I've been coming here since 1980. I'm oldish, right? So I'll go ahead and make you feel better there. So, but yeah, that's the irony, is that I've been coming to the state since 1980. But I mean, we would spend like 5 weeks here in the summer, and then we'd move on, right? So I didn't make any connections here. Kids my age, all that stuff. But yeah, the labels are true with us TCKs. I totally understand what you're saying. So no matter where our backgrounds are different, being that you're in the UK and you lived in Australia and all that stuff. But realistically, you and I are very similar in the sense of how we were raised and our upbringing and things like that. So No, I appreciate that answer. That's a true answer. So I'm going to guess when you, maybe not so much when you were in Australia, because you were born in, you're from the UK, born in Scotland. I'm an Irish boy, by the way. I just want you to know.
Yeah.
My family's from Cork, believe it or not. So yeah.
No.
My last name is German, but I'm more Irish than anything. So when I hear UK stuff, I definitely tap into that. But what I was getting at there is I don't know if you did this when you were in Australia, but when you definitely went to Africa, international schools. I'm going to assume that you went to an international school when you were in Africa. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. What was that status?
I wouldn't say it was an international school as such,
Okay.
like not part of the international circuit, if you like, but the schools in Nairobi were either the local schools for local kids, which was a very different standard of education, if you like, or I went to a school that was on the British system, and it was predominantly expat kids. There were some very few white kids that lived in Kenya, not as expats, but sort of born and bred there. But I guess that was sort of as close to an international school. And I certainly felt the difference when I left Kenya and I went to Perth. And I've posted about this in some of the Facebook groups, the TCK groups, about what was your hardest move as a TCK, growing up. And for me, without doubt, it was what seems to be typically the hardest age, which was 13, when I went from Kenya to Perth. And partly because of coming from what was more like an international school to a school in Perth, which I will add is geographically the most isolated city in the world, and you feel it there. So my school there was full of Australian kids who hadn't lived outside of Australia, and the classic monocultural kids, and they just did not get me, and it was horrible.
Yeah. So you sound, and I could be totally naive in saying this, but your accent sounds more UK-ish. Was that an issue? Because I'm just curious on this. Was that an issue when you went back to Australia? Did they say anything about your accent, or was it stronger Australian-ish when you were back there?
I don't remember at the time, but when I was 13, my parents said that I very quickly picked up a very strong Australian accent. And I actually have no recollection of that, but I totally know why I would have done it, which was just to try and fit in and blend in as quickly as I could. Now, yeah, I mean, I'm listening to myself now, and I guess I have the classic TCK thing again of depending on who I'm speaking with, my accent does change. And I have the thing now that I've spent considerable time in the UK, so I guess my Australian accent's worn off a bit. But most people here say, oh, you've got an Australian twang, you sound Australian.
Oh, really?
I go back to Australia, oh, you sound British. As I said, the perpetual foreigner.
Yeah, there you go. I totally get that. No, I appreciate that. I hear it from my own standpoint. I hear it as UK-ish, but I totally understand that when you go back, maybe it fluctuates between the two. So, but yeah, that, hey, as a proud TCK, I respect that. So it's all good. So, well, this is going to be a fun question because you are someone. Obviously, it's trickled down into your professional career, but I really can't wait to hear your answer to this. But let's talk about acclimation. So, again, I just want to make sure the people that are watching understand this. My guest today is Jen Mohindra. I am saying that correct, right? Mohindra?
Yes.
Okay. But I want to make sure people understand the acclimation process back to your passport country. So you are someone who, you just said you were adopted, born in Scotland, adopted, lived in the UK, lived in Australia, ended up in Kenya, and then you went back to Australia. Am I right there?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about that acclimation process. But what kind of passports do you have? I think you mentioned it earlier. I'm sorry.
So I have British and Australian passports.
Oh, yeah. Okay, dual citizenship. Which, by the way, those of you watching, that's so common, and I'm jealous. I have one. I have the US of A. which, by the way, for the first time in history, we're not allowed anywhere. So thank you, COVID. Thank you, government USA. But acclimation process back to the passport country, or at least back to Australia for this time being. How was that? Because how old were you when you left Kenya?
I was 13, so
Okay,
about 13
so
and a half.
definitely an influential time frame. I used to be a teacher, so I mean,
Ah,
influential time frame, but for sure. I was a sixth grade teacher for a long time, so just about a year younger than you were before you moved back to Australia. So talk about the acclimation process when you went back to Australia.
um, I'm struggling to find any positives about it. I found it
Yeah.
really tough. I think 13 is such a tricky age. You know, you've got puberty, teenage hormones. I went from uh, a country of game parks and wildlife and beautiful beaches to Perth. And I found Perth very dull in comparison. You know,
Now I'm gonna stop you real quick. My geography is not that great, I guess, but Perth, is that inland or is that's on the
Perth's
west
on the
side,
west
east side?
coast. It's on
Okay,
the west coast of Australia, down towards the bottom. And if you want to travel anywhere from Perth, you have to drive a really long way.
okay.
It's closer to get to Bali than it is to get to Sydney. So a lot of
Really? I've been to
local.
Bali. Been to Bali a couple times, so I get that. Wow, yeah. Okay, now I'm focused. You had me at Bali, so go ahead.
So yeah, it was just kind of tough, you know, the kids just didn't get me. I mean, I had all sorts of stories and that to tell about my time in Kenya. You know, I was in the expedition club at school where we used to go climbing, like rock climbing, caving, hiking, all those sorts of things, and was used to seeing wildlife in the school holidays. I mean, I can remember a long hike that I was on for about 12 days, and there was this time when it had just been raining and we were all drenched and feeling kind of a bit sad and sorry for ourselves because we were out in the bush. We kind of got a bit lost and we were all walking in single file, just kind of trudging along, all damp and carrying all our stuff.
Yeah.
And so there was a bit of a gap between me and the person ahead and the person behind. And we walked past this big sort of mound of pile of termite mounds, you know, the really big tall
Yeah.
ones. And this pack of warthogs came thundering out from these termite mounds and went right in front of me and went right behind me. And I
Yeah.
felt a whoosh of air on my face. And I just kind of stood there and watched these things go past and then sort of went, oh, what was that? And so I went from that sort of life to Perth. And I mentioned the beaches in Kenya are pretty special. And in Perth, I felt like it was just one long stretch of sea, sand, car park, road. You
Yeah.
know, not a tree or anything. And the kids at school all kind of raved about the beaches and didn't really understand why I kind of turned my nose up at them. Um, and I can remember being with a bunch of kids. I think this was maybe a little bit after school. And I totally got was subjected to the bragging line from them. So something came up in conversation, and I forget what exactly, but it was something about lions. And so I sort of piped up, and they were like, "Oh, so how many lions have you seen?" And I was like, "Well, quite a lot, really."
Yeah.
And I kind of wish that I just kept my mouth shut because of the ridicule that I got afterwards. So yeah, it was a tricky move.
No, I get it. I get it. My family moved to Hong Kong in '83, and we were there 3 years, and then Taipei. We ended up there, and from '86, I graduated from high school in '93. So, but there it was. I wasn't 13, but I'm trying to think. I guess I was 10. But yeah, just even that transition from Hong Kong to Taiwan was a little bit tricky. You know, you everything was so free and so fun and all that, when we were in Hong Kong, and then Taiwan. Don't get me wrong. I mean, eventually it was great, but I definitely struggled right away. Um,
Mm.
the blessing of that is that so many kids moved into Taiwan the same year I did, that it made the transition easier, but it didn't exactly represent the last 3 years of my life. And when you're 7, when you move overseas, 3 years is like 20 years, right? So
Yeah.
it's it was such a transition and a hard time right away, but it ended up being okay. So no, I appreciate the stories, and that's one of the things. I mean, good experience, bad experience, I totally get it. I totally get. Even though you're moving back to an English speaking place and all that stuff, and it's still a transition. Whether you realize it or not, it's still a transition. No matter who you are and what you've gone through. So I appreciate your stories. I get that. The lion story is awesome. So I'll have to keep that in mind. So let's push through then. Let's talk about advice for families acclimating back to their home passport country, because you definitely struggled a little bit, it sounds like. But we're gonna get into your professional career in just a second. But let's just throw this out there, because I mean, people watching, definitely people rewatching this. But let's talk about any kind of advice you give to families that have lived overseas. That's such a transparent thing that I want to get into. But families that are acclimating back to their home passport country, because that is a transition. Ironically, and I'll get to this later, that was a harder process for me. Sounds like it was for you as well. But acclimating back to, I mean, I was an American kid till I was 8, no 7, I guess. We moved overseas. I was overseas in Hong Kong and Taipei till Taiwan. So from 7 years old to 17. Now I would come back to the States. We do the summers here. We already talked about that. Split my time between Utah and Pennsylvania. But let's talk about the families that are currently maybe finding out today that they're moving back to their passport country. It's one of those thank you for your service type of things. But you're gonna be sent home. What kind of advice would you give to those people?
I think having an awareness of reverse culture shock and sort of knowing what that is, and the fact that it's not fatal, but it is real. So, you've been away from your home country, and you've probably changed and you've experienced different things. And you go back home, and depending on how long you've been away, there's quite likely to have been changes in your home country as well. But you're out of sync. So it's kind of hard to get back into the rhythm of, and not necessarily where you were, but a new rhythm back in your home country. I think that's the key thing, really. And also remembering that you might have memories of the place that was your home, and you come back and you're sort of like, oh, this doesn't really feel like. What actually might have happened is that you have memories of how it was, which is not necessarily how it is now. And it might be, as I said, because the place has changed or because you've changed. Mm-hmm. So it might not be actual memories of the place, but more sort of childhood memories, which maybe sort of idolized the place, or it just had a slightly different sort of lens on it.
No, I appreciate that answer, mainly because I've done it twice now. I went over obviously as a kid, and then I came back to the States when I was 17. But about 5 years ago, I went over to Shanghai. I accepted a job and I worked at an international school. It was actually, this is crazy to say, but it was actually harder as an adult to come back, because I had 2 years. I was in Shanghai for 2 years. And I did feel myself like, it was funny. I got off the plane. I've said this on the show a couple of times, but I got off the plane, and after 20 years being back in the States and then going back over, it was kind of an ironic thing, because I felt more comfortable. Most people are like, are you going to be okay? You're going to China, blah, 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 like all this stuff. And like, I'm good. Like, it's no big deal to me. I remember landing and walking off. The only thing that I had an issue with was the humidity. It wasn't about people. It wasn't about culture. It wasn't about anything like that. It was just like that humidity smacks you in the face, like, welcome home, right? So it's, but yeah, no, I totally appreciate that. And what you said is so entirely true. It's that trying to understand the concept of who you are when you move back. I was American. I'm 6'2". I'm athletic. I played baseball in college, and that was the part that I struggled with the most, because I felt the part intrinsically, And yet I had no idea what some of these guys were talking about. No idea how the cultural thing. I've been overseas for 10 years. Now, 10 years doesn't seem that long in the grand scheme of things. But you get this. When you're 7 when you move overseas and you're 17 when you come back, and don't get me wrong, you spent some summers in the States or wherever you were, it seems like you should be able to just transition no problem. That's not the case, because I've been overseas in a foreign country. I international schools, best friends were from all over the place. I've had some of them on the show. It is a transition. It truly is an acclimation process, whether you're realistically, okay with everything or not. And then when I did it as an adult, it's funny because I've been back in the States 20 years. You'd think I was more acclimated to being an American, right? Not the case. You get that bite, you get that 2 years overseas, and you're thinking like, this is more what I'm comfortable with. That's one of the reasons I got hired, actually, from what I was doing, is the fact that I grew up overseas. I have an MBA. I have a teaching background. That's one of the perks that got me hired. But it's such an interesting thing because you go over there and everyone's like, are you going to be okay? Are you going to be this? Are you going to be that? I'm like, that's the easy part. Like going back to Shanghai was the easy part. That didn't faze me at all after being gone for 20 years. Coming back to the States for the second time around, such a transition. Even now, I still struggle. So
yeah, there's been many people that I've spoken with who express the greater level of comfort in being a foreigner than being in their home country.
Yeah.
There's just sort of expectations of being at home that you will behave a certain way, that you will know certain things. The classic things like cultural references that maybe you've missed because you've been away, and sort of not being able to keep up with conversation, or sort of having gaps and just being made to feel like an outsider. But in your home country, it can be quite uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's funny you say outsider, because I don't know if it's, and maybe you're a professional at this, so I'm greatly glad that you're on this show, because I'm going to pick your brain left and right here in a minute when we talk about your professional status right now. But yeah, it's funny because I don't know if it's me or if it's those around me or both. But yeah, it's so funny because I've never lived here as a kid, but here I am in Utah, and it's such a transition. It's one of those things. I don't know if it's me. I don't know if it's something I've done personally, but it's just one of those things. So, what kind of it? Let's move on. Let's best advice. Let's talk about more advice. I mean, you're a professional at this, so you definitely know. But let's talk about advice because of your career. You started in hospitality, you ended up in banking, and now you're a TCK coach. I would have loved to have known you 27 years ago, right?
It's too late.
Yeah, a little bit late, but mainly because, and those of you that are watching, again, we're here with Jen Mohindra, but she's a TCK coach, and we're going to get into that. 1983 is when I moved to Hong Kong. 1986 is when I moved to Taipei. 1993 is when I moved back to the States. I could have easily taken your advice and run with it back in the day, but there wasn't such thing as a TCK coach back in the day. So explain, if you can, explain exactly what you do professionally, and then how did you become one, a TCK coach?
So as a TCK coach, as a TCK for TCKs, I help people to leverage their TCK experience to find the place that they can belong, that they can call home. The way we do this is with conversations like this, but it's a different structure that I will use. And what I'm really, my aim is to help people to really focus on the benefits of being a TCK rather than the challenges, some of which we spoke about sort of earlier on. There's two words that I'm going to say. And as a TCK, these two words will resonate with you. And those words are rootlessness and restlessness. And I can see you laughing because you know, right?
Yeah, totally. 100%. 100%.
So I help people with not just that, but a lot of it is around those two keywords, rootlessness and restlessness, so that people can find their place, that they can feel comfortable, that they can belong, and to really maximize the benefits, because we have such a wealth of experience from our diverse and somewhat nomadic upbringing. And I think it's such a shame not to sort of really use that to our advantage. How I became a TCK coach comes a bit of a tongue twister at times. As you said, I started out in hospitality, and I had a couple of career moves, and it kind of tied in with my TCK-ness, if you like, if that can be a word, because the thought of having one career for the rest of my life felt like living in one country for all of my life.
Yeah.
So
You get me. I'm laughing because you get me. I totally hear where you're going with this. So I love it. I love it. Go ahead.
But I got to a point a number of years ago where I just felt really stuck. I didn't know what I wanted to do, where I wanted to be. I just felt like I was at a crossroads. I knew I had choices, but I didn't really know what they were and which would be the best for me. So I employed a coach.
Okay.
And my coaching experience back then of being coached, it had such a profound effect on me. I was so taken with how I was able to explore within myself to find the best options for me to be able to move forward. Now, I went in mind thinking I wanted a career coach because I didn't know what I wanted to do for my next job. But I found that the coaching process helped me with so much more than that. I mean, yes, I did decide what I wanted to do career-wise, but we as people are holistic, and therefore we don't just compartmentalize the different sections of our life. So even though I was thinking that I was wanting to just do career coaching, I looked at a whole sort of range of stuff that was going on for me at the time. And I made the decision back then to get into finance. So I worked in banking for a number of years, but banking can be a little dry at times. And I got to the stage where I thought, I think I've reached my shelf life with this, and I wanted to do something that felt more meaningful to me. And it was a friend of mine that said, Jen, you would make an excellent coach. What are you doing? So that kind of sparked my memory of my coaching experience. And then I trained up and started doing it for real, and thought about, okay, who am I best equipped to help? Who can benefit the most from my services? I was like, well, TCKs, who else?
That's awesome. I love it. I love it. I just wish that was around when I was growing up, because especially when I was in college or after college, it would just been so beneficial. But let's continue on then. Let's get right into it. Your bio talks about how you help TCKs leverage their TCK journey into finding their place in the world. I want you to talk about that, but I can relate to this because when even though I can't believe this. This is what the passport says. I'm 44, soon to be 45. No business being 45, but it's yeah, it happens. Yeah. It's just such a weird thing because I've done okay. I was a teacher for a long time. I was an administrator when I was in Shanghai. I still view myself as a teacher, and yet you talk about that stuck mode. You talk about that confusion mode and all that stuff. It's just such a interesting concept for us TCKs. 1 minute you think you're this, and then the next minute you think you're that, and the next minute you think you're that, right? That's still, I'm 44 years old and I'm still in that process, right? I should know exactly what I wanted to do, just like most of the people I know here in the States. They have a goal, they've got this, they go boom, streamline, right, straight ahead, full force. But I'm still that guy that's like, I can do this for a while, I can do this for a while, I can do this for a while. So talk about that. Talk about, you talk about the leverage in terms of taking that experience of growing up the way we did and making that a leverage point, not necessarily a detractor, but a leverage point. Explain that concept.
I think it's really about focusing on the benefits of what we have as TCKs. Mm-hmm. That feeling of being stuck, it's very common. The feelings of rootlessness and restlessness and not really feeling like you belong and kind of having it in the back of your mind that maybe there's something better around the corner. Maybe there's something better if I went and lived there, or if I went and lived there, or perhaps if I hadn't lived in all these different places. Maybe I would have been a better person if I'd have just gone to one school and had a steady upbringing. And it's about looking at that from a different perspective. So a bit of a, I don't want to get into coach speak, but a bit of a mindset shift to be able to say, hey, no, this was a really good experience. And look at me, I'm resilient, I have tolerance, and I have all these other good qualities as a TCK. And to really look at what you need as a person, as an individual, what you need to make you happy and what you want. So you look at, say, if you're looking at where to decide, how to decide where to live, then you'd be looking at things like, well, what do you need around you? Like what are the actual necessities? And then sort of what's on your wish list that's going to, make you that much happier. And then it's a case of, trying to marry up those two lists and working out, well, what place is going to fit. It might sound simple, but if it was that easy, we wouldn't have these feelings of rootlessness and restlessness.
Yeah.
So that's where I come in.
Well, let me ask you this, and this wasn't one of the questions, but this is kind of off the path here. Even as a coach, do you still struggle?
I'd like to say no, but I'm not perfect. But I think I've reached a point where I know what makes me happy. And, the common question is, well, have you found the place that you want to be? And have you found that place that you can call home? And yes, I have. But I still have a bit of a, I could go and live somewhere else. I don't know if that will ever go away as being a TCK. But I think I'm in a place now where I feel settled and at home within myself. So I can take that feeling, I can sort of up and transport it to another place.
I love that. I feel the same. I totally feel the same. Well, now I'm gonna pick your professional brain here for a little bit. We've transitioned from the upbringing, your TCK stuff as a kid. Now you've transitioned into the coaching thing, and I'm going to pick your professional brain here. Let's talk about TCK stability. In terms of our biggest challenge, I say our because I am one, you are one. But in terms of our biggest challenge TCKs face in adulthood, what do you think that is?
Okay, let me paint a picture for you.
Okay.
So let's imagine you're at an event.
Okay.
It could be a party or something, and people are talking. There's drinks. There's canapes. It's all going very nicely, and you look across the room and you see a familiar face. You smile. You walk over, and she's talking to someone that you haven't met before. So you're introduced to each other, and then comes the question, Where are you from? And you have to reach down into your mental catalogue of pre-prepared answers and choose one that's right for the moment. And that could be, do you go for the short answer? Do you go for the long answer? Do you go for the one-word answer? Your response can be affected by your mood, the context, who's listening. Do you think that the person you're speaking with is going to be interested to ask you more, or do you think they're just wanting to put you into a box? That question, it's a simple question. It's only 4 words, right? But 4 words with multiple layers of hidden meaning. That can be one of the hardest questions for us, I think.
Absolutely. I still struggle with it. Like I said, I'm 44 and I still trying to figure out who the hell I am. So I totally understand that. Yeah, it's such a loaded question, right? So especially, I used to think that like the concept of where's home is such a loaded question, but just the challenges we face as TCKs in adulthood, we think we're one way, and then there's something about waking up one day and you're like, wait a minute, maybe that's not who I am. Even now, right? And you move to this pillar and you're like, okay, this is who I am. And then you wake up again, like it could be a week later, it could be years later, and you're like here. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. But I thought I was one way, now I'm here, and maybe that's not who I am in 3 years, right? And I think that is a byproduct of growing up the way we did. I don't know if you feel the same, but yeah.
Identity is a huge one for us because we've had so many influences and things coming at us from different angles and different places. And you mentioned, waking up one day and you think you're this, and then another day you think you're that. And then there's also the chameleon effect of,
Yes.
trying to blend into places that you might do it just, without even thinking. It's just second nature because that's what you've had to do to adapt and survive and get along as best as you could when you were growing up.
Yeah, totally. And I've been very fortunate. When I was in Idaho, I live in Utah now, but when I was in Idaho, I have made lifelong friendships, that they don't quite get me because I didn't grow up in Boise. I didn't grow up in Idaho, but they've accepted me and we're going to be lifelong friends. And I am beyond grateful for that. Here in Utah, I've got great friends here in Utah. But there's that little, like, it's almost like your entire life there's an asterisk or asterisk, whatever, however you say it in England, UK, right? So but there's always there's always that little asterisk right next to our names and who we are and things like that. But I'm so grateful for my friendships that I made in Idaho because I without even hesitating, so close to those guys still. And my buddies down here in Utah, same exact thing. And yet I still wonder if they totally understand me. They totally get who I am as a person, right? So I think you could appreciate that and understand what I'm saying there. But
for sure. That little asterisk that in brackets after your name, weirdo.
yeah, because I don't just transition easily. I don't understand how they grew up, and that the concept of one house that you grew up in, one place. Your parents still live in the same house. I've moved 27 times in my life. You get that more than anybody. And so, I mean, when I think about, like, whenever I'm filling out those, right before you land type of things, and you're filling out, your I'm trying to think what they call it. You know what I'm saying. But like when you're landing in a place that you're going to for the first time and you're explaining yourself and you're transitioning into a new place. Even when I was in Shanghai, who are you? Where are you from? Well, it's so funny when I moved to Shanghai. Like, I hadn't thought about that in years, and all of a sudden I'm landing. We're like an hour outside Shanghai, and they pass out, this is where you need immigration status and all this stuff, and they're passing out those cards, and you're like, oh, no problem. And it's like, oh crap, where am I from again? Like, where it's like it all comes back to you like that, right? So, but those are the things that the Idaho folks and the Utah folks don't see because they didn't grow up the way we did. But yet for as awkward and for as hesitant as some people may have been back in my college days and Utah days, early Utah days, teaching days, there are so many that are super welcoming, and I love that, and that calmed me down to a point, and yet you still, that Asterix thing, it's always like you always have that labeled over you. I'm okay with it now as an adult. Doesn't mean it's easier. It just means that's kind of who I've accepted myself as. And I'm gonna go right now because my buddy who's been on the show, Don Blevins, he's got a question for you. He says, "Do you find yourself in reciprocal patterns of feeling content and then not feeling content? Have you noticed the cycles, all that stuff?" For me, it's every 4 years. So yeah, let's talk about that then. Great question, Don. But cycle-wise, I always feel like after 3 years, I get antsy. I don't know why it's 3 years. I think it's maybe because I was in Hong Kong for 3 years and Taipei for 7 years. But there is definitely truth to what Don's saying. There's that itch maybe to move every 3 years or so many years. Do you find yourself conflicted with that? Or are you okay now? Or what's your thought process?
I think I'm okay with it now. I understand the concept of the 4 year or the 3 year itch, but for me, I think when I moved to Sydney and spent my 20s there, that was the longest that I had lived in one place. And despite all the moves within the actual city, I stayed in Sydney for a long time. And more recently, my move to London, I've now been here for the longest that I've ever lived in one place. So I can't say that I don't get itchy feet from time to time, but I think I've got to a point where I feel quite established. I feel like I've put roots down here. I think another thing that's helped me with that, with living in London, is that, obviously I've traveled a lot growing up, and I guess I still have the travel bug. But for me, coming from Australia to London in the UK, the travel that you can do from here so easily, being able to hop across to the continent for a long weekend is a very easy thing to do. Whereas from Sydney, my friends over there would have to jump on a 24-hour flight to get over here and do a little bit of hopping around on the continent. So I think having that sort of easy access to traveling into such diverse places on the continent has helped me to sort of not get into that pattern so much.
Awesome. I appreciate the honesty there. I'm going to ask you a deep question here, and it's something I still struggle with, and even ask my wife, I still struggle with this. But and again, I'm picking your professional brain now. So, why is it so hard for us TCKs to feel content?
When I hear the word content, I think of like calm, peaceful, grounded. And that's not something that we necessarily grew up with. That sort of, I'm home sort of feeling. We're more used to up to the next space, on to the next, do what I can to fit in. It takes a lot of mental energy, a lot of brain calories to fit into places and to be alert to the changes that are happening around us. So I think that's just becomes our sort of default setting, that we're kind of used to move, we're used to change, and that feeling of just being content, it's like, oh, am I missing out on something? Should I be somewhere else? Like it's not our default setting. It doesn't just sit naturally with us.
Yeah, I still struggle with that. Even as a 44-year-old man, I mean, it's one thing, like I think I'm good, and then there's something that maybe sparks my interest. I'm like, I should be there because I'm so used to moving so much. It's very difficult, and I think I speak for a lot of us TCKs. It's very difficult for us to be in the same place for over, I don't know. My itch is 3 years. My itch is maybe at the most 4 years. But but yeah, it's something that I think we all struggle with. It's not necessarily the grass is greener, right? I
Mm.
don't mean it. I don't mean it that way. It's just because of how we were raised, because there's so many moves, because you've been exposed to so many cultures and things like that. I definitely think there's almost that the contentness. We're good for a little while, and then there's got to be something more, right? And then we're good for that, and then there's got to be something more. It's such a intrinsically you know I don't know if it's ironic or whatnot, but it's just such a situation that I do feel that the TCKs that I've talked to, the people that I grew up with, even now,
Mm-hmm.
they're the same way. They're like I don't know what it is. They can't figure it out. They can't pinpoint it. But there's something about every 3 years or every 5 years, I feel like I should be somewhere. I feel like I should be moving on. And I that's my wife. Her parents still live in the same house she grew up with. Boggles my mind. Like I can't even fathom how like right. So I can't
Yeah.
even fathom. I go with great people. I love them to death. But it's something that I can't understand. Like we go over to her parents only live a 20-minute drive from us, 15 at the most. And it's one of those things that like I just can't even fathom. Like that was your bedroom growing up. Mine was like 15 houses ago. So it's such a twisted, and I mean this positively, like a twisted way of reality for us is just that there's an itch, there's something that triggers us cognitively where you're like, okay, it's time to move on, time to move on, time to move on. It's a blessing and a curse the way I view it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting what you mentioned about how different
Mm-hmm.
we are to monocultural
Yeah.
people, and how, as much as the thought of living in one place for your whole life is a foreign concept to
Mm-hmm.
us, so are we to
Yeah,
them.
that's true. That's true. No, totally true. Yeah, and again, it's not a right or wrong answer. It's just the
It's just
way.
different. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just the way we grew up. It's what we know, and luckily I picked a good one, and she understands what I go through. And uh, the perk of that is that her mom. I've said this on the show many times. Her mom worked for an airline, so while she wasn't a TCK, they explored the world in the summer break. So they would go overseas. They would go explore. I think that helped. I think that's one of the perks of why we've made a connection is because she's not from like podunk, middle of nowhere, born and raised, never left.
Mhm.
She saw the world. She wasn't a TCK, but she saw the world growing up, and
Mhm.
I think that definitely helps. But yeah, but trying to understand that logic of this is the house you grew up in. Okay, this was your bedroom. Okay, this is the only place you've ever lived, and yet on my resume I've got 27 addresses, in my lifetime. Um, it boggles my mind, but yeah, I respect it, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. We talked about that. It's just how it is. It's just what you and I experience, and so much of back in the day, there wasn't someone like you, there wasn't a TCK coach. What I would have given to go to college or even transition back to my parents, go see my parents at Christmas time, go see my parents in the summertime when they were living, they moved on, they ended up in Singapore. I had no connection to Singapore. And while it was one hand, it was great to be like, yes, I'm going overseas for a Christmas holiday. The other hand of me was like, okay, I'm going into a place that I don't even know. Like they had moved on, even though I was back in the States, they had moved on. Such a wild way to grow up, right? It's just I got to put this on. Don just wrote again. It says, "Have you found TCKs who have moved back to where you grew up? Do they like it, or do they realize the itch is still there to move on? For me, I grew up in Southeast Asia and often think about moving back, but I've lived in the States for 20 plus years." So I guess if I'm hearing you right, Donnie, you're just asking like for us TCKs, we grew up so different in intrinsically, and then we kind of acclimate back home, and yet there's always that itch. Like, have you experienced in your coaching career, have you experienced so many people that want to get back to where they grew up?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of scenarios, but yeah, some people want to go back to, sometimes to get sort of some sense of roots, because that's where
Mm-hmm.
they started out. And it might be that, extended family is there and they want to get to know them. So yeah, there's different scenarios, but we touched on earlier about going back to your home country, reverse culture shock, that sort of thing. And I'm reading Don's point here, and having lived in the States for 20 years, I would imagine that Southeast Asia has changed quite a bit since then, and his memories of what it was like, that might not quite be the same now.
Yeah, and he's in even a different place. And Don's been on the show, and so that's why I feel comfortable talking about this. His mom's from South Korea, his dad's American, and so he's got even that. I guess not issue is the wrong word, but he's got that conflict maybe of trying to cling on to his roots of being from Korea, allowing his daughters to experience Korea, and then yet the comfort level is probably the States now, being he's been back here 20 years. So I totally get that. Yeah.
So he's got that extra mix in his TCK Petri dish.
Yeah. Yeah. He's even got that over me, right? So I'm just a 6'2" white guy that happened to grow up overseas. Don is a multicultural guy, intrinsically and just living his life. So he's got 3 great daughters, and yeah, he's bicultural just in terms of birth, right? So he was a cultural, his mom, like I said, his mom's from South Korea. His parents met in Korea. And so his mom, like I said, he transitions between those 2 cultures, which I'm sure you see a lot as a coach.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, great question, Don. Thank you for chiming in. So, it's hard for me to say Don because I knew him when he was back, in 1980, in the 80s when he was Donnie. So I have to be careful saying Don versus Donnie. Yeah, he and I were in the same grade back in Taipei American School. So. But let's transition a little bit then. What about the advantages of being a TCK, in terms of what we possess? And if you don't mind, I know this was on, I've looked in your blog, by the way, I posted your blog. I'm going to post it again real quick. I just want to make sure I got to jump up here. Let's see if I can scroll up, but either way, my point to this is advantages of being a TCK, because not a lot of people always remember that. There's your website, right? Did I post that right? Okay.
Yeah.
In terms of advantages though of being a TCK, because we always talk about the conflicts, we always talk about the horror stories, we always talk about the transition, the acclimation process, all that stuff. But let's talk positively, because that's one thing that sometimes gets lost, right? There are advantages to being a TCK. I'm living proof of that. But it's kind of a 2-part question: the advantages of being a TCK, and then this is something that really I loved. I read your blog, I read your website. Let's talk about careers for TCKs, because I was so fascinated by that concept. If you don't mind, if you can talk about the advantages, and then the second part of that is, what type of careers for TCKs do you recommend?
So the advantages, we've had often such a rich wealth of experience, being exposed to different cultures, different ways of living, different people. And a couple of points that I mentioned before, this exposure to differences makes us very often tolerant. Not always, but as a whole, as a generalization, I'd say we're pretty tolerant. We spoke just before about the difference between us, TCKs, and monocultural people. And this is something that often comes up either in coaching conversations. I've seen it on the discussion boards in the TCK Facebook groups, and that is about whether TCKs want to have friendships with non-TCKs. Like, do they get us? Will they understand us? And I think because of our exposure to so many different cultures and places, and it's a choice, if we choose to be open to those differences in other people that haven't had our sort of varied background, then I think that puts us in a really great position, because we have such a wealth of understanding from our rich experiences, and then to be able to have that level of understanding also for people that haven't, I think that puts us in a very good position. And for thinking about careers, global mobility is on the move, on the rise rather. We have technology now. I mean, you're in Utah, I'm in London, here we are having a chat. And it's much more likely these days in a work sense that you're going to be communicating with people who are not from your home country. So a lot of people want careers that have some sort of international flavor to them. And if I think back to my earlier years, I absolutely slotted into that. So the reason that I chose...
Everybody still calls him Donnie.
The reason I chose hospitality was because it was kind of related to travel. And I knew that I would be conversing with people on a daily basis that were traveling to the city that I was working in, so that I wasn't just going to be working with people from Perth, which is where I started out my career. Other careers might involve where you can make the most of being bilingual, trilingual, or more than that. Mm-hmm. My career in banking, I worked for global banks, and my first banking job in particular, we had a presence in 60 countries around the world. And as part of my job, I used to monitor the data submissions from these 60 countries and have to organize meetings across time zones and stuff. And I think because of my familiarity with having lived in different places and being used to speaking to different people, recognizing that, say, a Western way of communication can be quite different to some of the Asian countries, for example, things like eye contact, whether yes means yes, or is it just that they don't want to say no, or all those sorts of things. So I think that those, if we choose to, we can use those things to really sort of leverage our experience to our advantage for our careers, as well as our personal lives as well.
Absolutely. No, I love that answer. What about misconceptions then? We talked about the advantages of TCKs and the career, oriented side of things. But let's talk about misconceptions of us TCKs. What's your maybe the biggest misconception, or maybe a couple of misconceptions? But what do you think we get misconceptionized as?
I think that the biggest misconception for TCKs is that we are privileged.
Yes, great answer. Explain why. Yeah.
Because we lived in different places, that therefore our parents must have been rich to be able to afford to live in different places, that we might have had a silver spoon, been born with a silver spoon in our mouth, so to speak. And that's really not the case always, mostly. If I think back to the scenario that I described before about, talking about how many lions I'd seen when I'd lived in Kenya, to the kids that I knew in Perth, and they were sort of like, how many lions have you seen? I was like, well, it's just the way it was. It's just how my life was. It didn't make me privileged to have had the opportunity to have lived amongst, all these game parks and stuff. I feel very fortunate, don't get me wrong, but I wouldn't say it was privileged. And I can think of another example around that as well. Someone I know who is a TCK recently broke up with her boyfriend, who was not a TCK. And the final straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, was that she mentioned something about having had servants because she lived in Africa. And he just totally didn't get it. He just thought that she was really stuck up because they had staff. And my own experience of living in Kenya is that, in our house, we had a separate building, which was the servants' quarters. And my parents didn't want to have staff. They just, it wasn't our scene. They didn't want us to have servants. But until we did, we had a steady flow of people coming up and like queuing up to the house, wanting to speak to my parents, saying, "Oh, we've noticed your servants' quarters are empty. We'd like to come and work for you." And it was even seen as sort of depriving people of work because we were, not local Africans and we could afford to have servants. That, it was just the way of life. It was a different way of life, but it was the norm for us. But that didn't make us privileged.
I can totally relate to that because when we were in Hong Kong, my dad was in the corporate side of McDonald's, but then he left McDonald's and he started his own company, and that's why we moved to Taipei. So we had Hong Kong days. It was called an ama, right? And then yeah, she definitely lived with us. It was kind of a built-in babysitter, all that stuff. But when we moved to Taipei, my dad was on his own, and he was paying the bills. He was paying the school fees. He was paying. We didn't have the luxuries of some kids. Um, Definitely had friends of mine that had, you know, you talk about servants and maids and things like that. We didn't have that in Taipei. So I totally relate to what you're saying because I mean, so many times I've been called like, oh, you must have just been so rich or so this or so that. Wasn't the case. It's not the case
Exactly.
for everybody. And even the kids that did have that, it's definitely a misconception because I know I'm thinking off the top of my head right now, but the kids that I know that their parents worked for maybe banks, Bank of America, Bank of whatever. Um, yes, they had privileges in terms of school was paid for, and that still happens now. When I was in Shanghai, my job in Shanghai was to meet with families that were potentially moving to this, the area, and talking them into going to our school. A lot of their costs were covered. You know, I get it, totally great. We were not that fortunate. My dad was self-employed, and that just happened to be his business. Um, but that doesn't mean necessarily that those kids that had those advantages were spoiled either, because I totally understand that. Great people I'm still friends with today. They just had the luxury of the being allowed to have those costs covered and things like that, and servants and maids and things like that. But it doesn't. They never. The beauty of growing up overseas, and you're 100% right, because there's definitely a misconception of we were so spoiled. Life was so great. Like there's definitely struggles. Even those people that had school covered, had servants. You're still in a foreign country. Like
Yeah,
let's not back that. Let's kind of
exactly.
go back to there's still struggles that you're going to intrinsically experience, whether you have the capability of having every cost covered. And that does happen, and that's great. No harm, no foul there. It's just a matter of make sure we truly understand that you're not spoiled because of how you're growing up. It just is your story. It becomes your story,
Yeah.
right? It becomes of who you are. And one of the things I love about the people that I grew up with, there were I had friends that had parents that were teachers who so based on the fact that they were in international schools, yeah, they had their fees waived, right? Because they were teachers. I had friends that parents were big wigs in corporations. They had their fees waived. Great. They're still good people. They're still solid people who believe in the structure of what you and I have been talking about for the last hour and 15 minutes. It's just about, they truly, even, we talk about this. I've talked about this on the show. That one of the blessings that I've had is my best friends to this day are people I grew up with. Mainly because you don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to, we may not talk every day. Um, but we still have these Zoom calls. We still have all these things, and it's we're pushing 27 years from high school days, but we're still all the same, right? We get on Zoom calls and we bicker and we fight, and we fight in a positive way. We make fun of each other. We do all the things that you're supposed to do.
Yes.
Some of those kids were corporate kids. Some of those kids were missionary kids. Some of those kids were teacher kids. We all still collectively get along because we never saw it that way. We just saw that we're all transitioned into the same place at the
Mm.
same time. and we get along. And it didn't matter whose dad was making more money. It didn't matter whose mom was making more money. We just were all in the same boat. And I think transitionally, that's been so awesome, that I can still pick up a phone and call people that understand me. They're stateside, there's ones in Hong Kong, everybody's transitioned all over the world. But at the end of the day, we were the same. It never came up. Maybe that was different for you, but it never came up in terms of what does your dad do? I can only hang out with you if you're, you've got servants, you've got servants, or your dad is this so big wig. It was what it was, and I love the fact, I still think back and still when we talk, we have, like I said earlier, I have no business being 44, but it's like we get on that Zoom call and it's just time stands still. We float right back into our senior year of high school, and I love it. It's what, I don't know if you experience this too, but like it's so relaxing because you don't have to explain yourself. For once, you don't have to tell these people who you are and where you're from. And so I totally understand what you're saying. The misconceptions, yeah, big time. When I got back to the States, same exact thing. Oh, you must be loaded. No.
Yeah.
My dad paid for everything. My parents paid for everything out of their pocket. You must be crazy, rich, wealthy. No. It just happens to be our story. Not right or wrong. It just happens to be our story. It's blessing more than a curse, totally. But yeah, I mean, I understand the perspective of where they're coming from. I totally understand that. But the reality is, yeah, it's just everybody's different. Their stories, while different, are the same and all that. But it's yeah, some misconceptions. I appreciate that because I totally relate to that 100%. Even to this day, even to this day.
Yeah.
I didn't grow up wealthy. My brother and I didn't grow up wealthy. My parents, worked hard for everything they had, and blessing to my dad and my mom, who kept us on the right path. And it was never about you're better than everybody here. It was just, this is what it is. You'll respect their values. You're in a different country. You expect their traditions, their concepts, all that stuff. You don't have to love it, but you have to try it, and I'm so grateful for that. So yeah, I appreciate your answer. So
it's interesting what you said there, is that you don't have to love it, but just try it. And I think that's one of our advantages as well, is that we are, just by the nature of our upbringing, we're much more open to trying new things.
Right. And the irony is, of course I loved it, right? I love Chinese food. And when I say Chinese food, I don't mean the Americanized version where everything's tangy. But I did love it. And it was just I tip my hat to my parents for allowing me to experience that. It wasn't always easy. I'm not sitting here saying that everything was, perfect and hunky-dory and all that stuff. But I look back now 20 plus years later and think, wow, what a I'm almost more flabbergasted now at the way I grew up than when I was in it. Right? Like you look back and think you hit it right on the head. It's that cultural concept. You learn so much without even realizing it. You learn so much. It may take a year, it may take 5 years, it may take 20 years, but you look back now and think, what a blessing. Like I've learned so much about people and the cultures and experiences. How do you even begin to explain what you went through and the experiences you went through, right? And it's not a blessing. I'm not sitting here on a high, pedestal thing. My upbringing was the greatest ever, because there were struggles. There were moments of like, this is not easy. There were bickering between, homes and families and things like that. It's not perfect, but what a blessing, more than anything, the way I view it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna transition now, because you are also a podcaster. I don't even know what this is called. I guess it's a webcast, but I want to make sure people see you are also a podcast host. Your podcast is called People Like Us. Something I've listened to in on my own time. Talk about that, and how did that come to be? Your podcast.
So that came about after a conversation I had with a friend who kind of said, "Hey, why don't you do a podcast, Jen?" And that's how it came to be. And because of the work that I do with TCKs, it was a nice opportunity for me to give a voice to other TCKs so that we could hear about each other's stories. And one of the things that's been so beautiful about it is that, we all have our own very unique individual stories, but we have this common thread of understanding. One of the other things that I've greatly enjoyed about hosting these podcasts is that quite a few of the people who I've had as guests on my show didn't realize that they were a TCK until they heard the podcast, and then they came on themselves and spoke about their experiences. So there's often that sort of epiphany, if you like, of when you discover the term third culture kid, and you realize that there's other people like you or people like me, that you're not just this sort of lone weirdo out there, that other people have this sort of nomadic upbringing as well. So it's been really nice for me to have people on, share their stories, and share the TCK concept, I guess.
When did you first hear the term TCKs? Because it was somewhat new to me. By the way, I'm typing, so don't think I'm. I just want to make sure your web or your podcast, the title of it gets mentioned here. So go ahead and talk about the first time you heard the whole TCK concept.
Yeah, so it was quite a while ago for me, although certainly well into my adulthood. I was at a social event and I had met somebody who, as it happened, was from Kenya. And I said to her, oh, I used to live in Kenya for a few years, when I was a child. So she asked me about where I had grown up. And I think that's how she phrased it, was where did you grow up, rather than where are you from? Because she was a TCK too. And when I went, sort of rattled off the places, and then we moved to, and then we moved to, and then we moved to, she said to me, oh, well, there's a term for people like you. And she told me about this, third culture kid. She told me where to look it up online. And I went away and I found the Bible, the David Pollock, Ruth Van Reken book. And I just kind of took it from there. And this was when I was in London. So London being the big, diverse city that it is, I looked up Meetup. I found a couple of TCK groups, and I went along to some social events and just had this amazing experience of sitting around a table. And when it got to the point of sharing stories, we all kind of went round one by one. And it was like, wow, these people just get me and I don't have to explain. And that's great.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was talking about. When I have these, we kind of hold a big Zoom. It was Zoom conferencing and Zoom meetings before Zoom meetings were cool, right? We were doing it for a while now. But yeah, that's exactly right. You don't have to explain yourself. You just pick up right where you left off, and nobody's saying where you're from. Nobody's saying like what's your hometown. Nobody's saying like, wait, you grew up how? Right. So it's just a relaxed conversation. I mean, these are people. Some of these people I haven't literally physically seen in 20 plus years yet, because of who they are, because of how they grew up, because of how I grew up. There's that kinship. It's a family atmosphere. I look at them as brothers and sisters more than anything, and I think you can probably relate to that. So
yeah, for sure. Our tribe.
yeah, exactly. Well, let's. You hinted at it earlier, and we're kind of winding down, but this is a perfect time to ask this question now. Let's talk about travel bug. Obviously, travel bug. Obviously, COVID has kind of thrown a tricky hand in this. But do you still have that travel bug? As someone who grew up the way we did, I mean, I think I already know the answer to this, but do you still have that travel bug?
I could say no and trick you, but no, I do. Yeah. Absolutely, yes. I do have the bug. There's just, I consider myself to be reasonably well-traveled, but there's so many more places yet to be discovered, unexplored, and yeah, I don't think that will ever go away. I hope it doesn't.
No, I'm with you, 100% with you. It's one of those ironic times in my life. With that U.S. passport, I'm so used to being able to just go places. This is the first time, with COVID hitting, I haven't even been on an airplane since March. It doesn't even make sense to me. It's like, I try to explain it to people and things like that. It's not about being right or wrong. It's just how we grew up. I'm so used to having plans and making reservations, airline tickets, even now, going on a holiday, things like that, just having somewhere to go, having plans, that's all been halted. I think, this sounds so selfish, but the biggest thing that COVID smacked me in the face on is just the travel. We're not allowed to really go anywhere right now, and so that's been a struggle. But like you, yeah, travel bug, I totally have it. There's so many places I want to go. Right.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. What'll be the
let's
first place you'd like to go to once we can?
good question, because that's one of the last questions I'm going to ask you in my last three questions. But I was fortunate enough when I left Shanghai. I actually met some buddy in some families that I knew well in Ireland. So I was finally able to get to Ireland. Like I told you when we started,
Mm,
I'm more Irish than anything. My last name's German. My wife's German. Ish, her dad's was born there, and so he's technically German. So I love to get to Germany. I love to see more of Europe. But having said that, the fact that I grew up in Asia, Asia's like a second home to me, if not a first
mhm,
home to me. So the concept of wanting to explore Asia more and see things, even when I was in Shanghai, this is kind of funny. Like my wife came over and saw me for a while when I was winding my time down. She wasn't my wife yet, but she's such an adventurer that she was able to get out and see more of Shanghai as a tourist than I did. When you're in a place, it's work, it's work, it's work, it's work.
yeah,
You definitely go out and experience things with people that are there, but the touristy side of things I didn't see. And so I actually would like to go back to Shanghai and see the touristy side of things that I didn't necessarily see. Love Japan, loved Okinawa, been to Thailand many times, but I would love to go and explore, like, Penang again, and places
mhm,
that have beaches and things like that. So, but
sure.
realistically, there's also the side of me that I like to go anywhere that I've never been. I've
Yeah,
never been to Russia. I've never been. This is ironic. I'm American. I finally went to Canada a couple of years ago, and yet I've never been to Mexico, which is so ironic, right? So it's the places that border the states I've really haven't spent a ton of time in.
sure.
So it's kind of funny when I think about that. But yeah, I like you. I just hand me my passport. I'm gone. It
Yeah,
doesn't matter where. Just tell me where and when, and I'm there. So
yeah, I'm
it's
with you on that.
yeah, yeah. So what about other passions then? What inspires you? Talk about your passions and what still inspires you, and things like that.
Well, aside from the obvious one, which is coaching, of course, um, one of my greatest loves is cycling. I had the fortune of cycling around central London during the height of lockdown when we had no traffic, and it was absolutely incredible. Cycling around the sort of what are usually really busy shopping streets, absolutely deserted. It was like some scenes from a disaster movie. I also quite like photography, so I was out with my camera on and my bike, happy as anything, cycling around the quiet streets. And then last year, I went on my first cycling holiday, which was to South India, and absolutely loved it. Oh, it was two of my favourite things: cycling and travelling, all in one. So yeah, I'd say those are sort of the biggest things for me. Living in central London, there's opportunity pre-COVID.
By the
Uh,
way, my dog made an appearance. I told you she would at some point.
oh,
So
I
go ahead.
think. Since I've lived in London, there's so much to do culturally, as in arts sort of stuff. I love contemporary dance, ballet, um, art exhibitions, modern arts, sport for choice here. So that's been another thing that's been tough in terms of COVID restrictions, the lack of travel and the lack of being able to go out and see and do stuff. I look forward to when things are a little more relaxed, a little more back to normal.
I totally agree. How was India? I've never been there.
India was amazing. I kind of kicked myself a little bit for not having gone sooner. Um, it's not going anywhere. I can go back.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've never been. I love the food. I've just never been to India. So, well, look, we've made it to the last three questions. You've seen the show, so I'm assuming you know it's kind of going to be asked here. But let's talk about something that maybe people don't know about you. Is there anything specifically? What do you think?
So I mentioned right at the beginning how I started out my life in Scotland and that I was adopted in Scotland by a white English family. So when I was living in Sydney, I traced my birth mother and I discovered both of my biological parents. And at the age of 31, I discovered that my father was Indian. So
Wow.
I had grown up actually being led to believe that I was white.
Okay.
And I discovered that I was mixed race, and I got to learn why I tan so well.
I do not. I'm Irish, German. So yeah, yeah. No, that's amazing.
So,
Yeah, that's
so
interesting.
even though my surname is Indian, obviously I changed it to my birth family.
Oh
Uh,
wow. Okay.
People don't automatically assume that I'm half Indian, but I am.
No, that's interesting. What about siblings? Do you have siblings?
I have so my birth parents went on to get married after I'd been given up, and they had two more kids. So I have two full-blooded brothers, all here in central London, who I'm very close to.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. What this is another question I always ask. It's one of the three, but if you could have a conversation, if you could sit down, whether it's a park bench, whether it's over a pint, anything, what who, you know, in terms of a conversation, who would you love to have a conversation with and why?
So I thought about this question, and I thought and I thought and I thought, who would I want to speak with? Um, I think there's probably a couple. One would be maybe a younger version of my birth mother,
Oh wow.
and the other, I think, the poster boy TCK, Barack Obama,
Yep.
to talk with him about how his TCK upbringing has influenced his career and life choices.
He's a good one. Yeah, he's definitely a good one. Yeah, I second that. Your birth mother question is definitely interesting. Did you have the luxury of meeting them or no?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, you
Um,
did.
yeah, that they live in central London. I'm very close to them.
Oh wow. Okay. Perfect. Perfect. Well, let's just do it. The final question then. You know, you asked me earlier. I'm gonna throw it back at you. What's where is it that you still want to travel to?
Um, so I've been in London for a little over 15 years now, and it's been very easy to travel places from here. You can jump on a plane and be in another city on the continent in, a couple of hours, if that. And so during my time here, I've done lots of sort of city hops, if you like, to the continent. I've explored many some Eastern European cities. And now I've spent so much time in London and I spent a long time in Sydney. So I'm much more into the idea of exploring more of the countryside. So my cycling holiday in India was wonderful for that. It was on the southern coast in Kerala, and it was just sort of riding along coastal routes and through some of the countryside there, just absolutely amazing. So my next cycling holiday, I think I've seen one that I've had my eye on. I need to get my cycling fitness up a little bit, but it's a couple of weeks through Namibia,
Oh wow.
which I need to start training, I think.
Yeah. No, I love it. Yeah, I'm jealous too. Um, well, listen, those are my questions, and I know you're kind of going through some things right now, and my yeah, empathetic side of is alive and well. So just I hope everything's okay on your end. You and I
Thank
talked
you.
off screen. You know, you definitely have my thoughts are with you, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So,
Thank
but
you.
keep me posted. But thank you so much for doing this. This has been amazing. I like I said, I wish when I first of all, when I went to college, 20 plus years ago, I wish there was someone like you. I could have bounced some ideas off of you and listened to your wise words. So that's one thing I want to say real quickly is that if there are people watching, that are struggling with, maybe they're not a TCK, but their kids are. I mean, you're definitely someone who I can only reflect in terms of my own experience, but you're someone who's taken this and gone with it and definitely making a difference to our community of the TCK community, and I appreciate that. So thank you so much for what you do.
My pleasure.
Yeah, keep it up. But I also before we technically log off, I gotta say this real quickly. Our buddy Calvin, you and I both know Calvin.
Yeah, I was on the show.
Yeah, exactly right. So he had his 1 year anniversary of doing his own show. So I want to give him a quick shout out.
Fantastic. Well done, Calvin.
Yeah, exactly. So, but having said that, also 2 birthdays. I like to kind of brag about birthdays on this. One of mine is one of the first one is Erin Mahan, or she's actually Erin. Oh man, I'm blowing it right now. She's Erin Mahan to me, so she'll always be Erin Mahan to me. We grew up together. She's one of those kids that I talked about that's always on those Zoom calls. But she's someone that I grew up with. It was her birthday yesterday, and then my brother Jason, who put up with me as a little brother for so many years, and I just want to give him a quick shout out. It's his birthday today. But back to you, Jen. Thank you so much for doing this. This has been fantastic. I'm so glad we had the chance to finally, chat. But you're an inspiration. The TCK community is lucky to have someone like you. And like I said earlier, I wish back in the day I would have known about somebody like you and what you're doing. So thank you so much for what you do in the community. So
thank you, and thanks for having me today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Definitely. Well, stick around. I'm gonna close this off at the end of the broadcast, but stick around. I'll chat with you right as we go offline real quick too.
For sure.
But thank you everybody for watching. No matter where you're watching, if you're watching on the replay, all that stuff. This has BenThere episode 26. We're gonna do about 4 more of these for the first. I think it's 3 more of these now that I think about it. For the first season, and then we're gonna take a break for about a month and then come right back. But thank you for watching, whether it's on Facebook, on YouTube, if you're seeing this on a replay, either way. But this is a treat for me. I love speaking with people like Jen. Please make sure, and Jen, I'm gonna pull your website back up real quick. There it is. Check out Jen's website. It's jenmohindra.com. But it's worth a read. It's worth your time. Give it a visit, especially if you're a TCK, because I read, Jen, I said this in the beginning. I'm going to say this now. I looked at your stuff before we went live, and it just made so much sense to me. So if you're a TCK watching, check her stuff out. You won't be disappointed. She's pretty amazing. So, Jen, thank you so much for doing this, and we'll talk soon. But yeah, stick around. But again, thank you to all those that are watching, wherever you're watching, how you're watching. BenThere episode 26. We'll be back next week for episode 27. Until next time, you guys take care.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.